You want to visit Venice this summer. Before you even book a hotel, you might have to pay just to walk into the city. Not a museum ticket, not a gondola ride, an entrance fee to enter the historic center itself. This isn't a hypothetical. It's happening right now, and Venice is just the beginning. Let's break down the real economics of why Europe is suddenly charging you to visit. Here's the headline story. Starting in April 2026, Venice became the first city in the world to introduce a direct access fee for day trippers entering its historic center. Book at least 4 days in advance, and it's €5. Wait until closer to your trip, and it jumps to 10. The fee only applies on designated peak days, around 60 of them between April and July, and only targets day visitors, since anyone staying overnight already pays a separate accommodation tax. The money goes toward maintaining the canals, the historic sites, and the environmental upkeep of a city that's slowly sinking under both water and foot traffic. But Venice isn't alone, and the pattern is spreading fast. Barcelona has pushed its overnight visitor tax up to 16% in 2026, with legislation already locked in to climb toward 20% by 2030. The city has also allocated roughly €120 million specifically to buying out tourism-focused businesses in its historic center, an attempt to restore some balance to neighborhoods that had become almost entirely tourist infrastructure. Amsterdam has combined higher tourist taxes with an outright freeze on new hotel development, plus a separate €15 per person cruise levy targeting the day tripper cruise crowd specifically, the same demographic Venice is targeting with its own entry fee. Edinburgh introduced its own 5% accommodation levy in July 2026, applying to stays of up to 7 consecutive nights across hotels, guest houses, and short-term rentals alike, with the revenue earmarked for maintaining the city's cultural and tourism infrastructure. And the Louvre, of all places, now charges non-EU visitors more than EU visitors for the exact same ticket. A dual pricing model that sparked its own separate debate about fairness, since it's one of the first major cultural institutions to explicitly price by nationality rather than by age, student status, or time of visit. Here's the part that makes this genuinely different from a typical tourist tax. This isn't really about the money at all. It's about housing. Short-term rentals converted entire neighborhoods in cities like Barcelona into de facto hotel districts, pricing local residents out of homes they'd lived in for generations. Barcelona has accelerated the removal of short-term rental licenses specifically to return those units to the local housing market. The tourist tax hikes are almost a secondary tool. The real fight is about who gets to actually live in these cities. And that fight has turned into genuine, visible protest. A coalition called SET, the Southern European Network Against Touristisation, founded back in 2017, and coordinated demonstrations across more than 16 cities in June 2026, including Barcelona, Venice, Lisbon, and Palermo, with delegates from across the coalition meeting in Barcelona to plan tactics ranging from peaceful marches to more confrontational street actions. Some of this has stayed peaceful marches, some of it hasn't. Barcelona saw tourists sprayed with water pistols by protesters back in 2024, an image that went viral precisely because it captured something real, a growing local sentiment that tourism has stopped being a benefit to these cities and started being an occupation. One protest sign that circulated widely put it bluntly: "Your Airbnb used to be my home." The Canary Islands have become a particular flashpoint too, with residents there among the loudest voices arguing that tourism volume, not just tourism pricing, is the actual problem. A distinction that matters, because it means taxes alone may not be enough to resolve the underlying tensions. So let's talk about what this actually costs you, the traveler, because the fees stack in ways that catch people off guard. Take a hypothetical family of 4 planning a 1-week trip through Venice, Barcelona, and Amsterdam. In Venice, if they're day tripping in during peak season, that's €5 to €10 per person just to enter, on top of whatever else they're spending. Call it €20 to €40 for the family, just to walk through the gates. In Barcelona, a 5-night hotel stay now carries up to €15 per person per night in tourist tax alone, which adds up to roughly €300 in tax for the family before a single meal or attraction ticket. In Amsterdam, they're looking at a 12.5% room tax on top of the nightly rate, or a separate €15 per person cruise levy if arriving by ship. None of these numbers looks dramatic in isolation. Stacked across this one multi-city trip, that same family can easily rack up an extra €400 to €500 in fees that simply didn't exist even 3 or 4 years ago. A genuine added cost of a modest overseas flight, buried entirely inside line items most travelers don't budget for in advance. This is worth pausing on, because it's a pattern you'll recognize from other parts of the economy. Nobody balks at a €5 fee. Nobody cancels a trip over €15 a night. Each individual charge is deliberately sized to sit below the threshold where a tourist stops and reconsiders. It's the exact same psychological mechanism behind why subscription services charge small monthly amounts instead of one large annual fee, or why a 4-payment plan feels less painful than paying a price tag in full. Cities have effectively discovered that tourism fees work best when they're priced in small enough that no single one feels like the reason to skip the trip, even as the total adds up to a genuinely different vacation budget than travelers were planning around. This is the same behavioral pattern we've covered on this channel before. The pain of a cost depends enormously on how it's broken up and presented, almost independent of the actual total. And Europe's tourism boards appear to have discovered this instinctively, the same way retailers and lenders did decades earlier. There's also a fairness debate hiding inside all of this, and the Louvre's dual pricing is the clearest example. Charging non-EU visitors more for the same ticket raises real questions about whether this is smart tourism management or a form of discrimination based on nationality. Supporters argue EU citizens already fund these institutions through taxes their whole lives, so a differentiated price simply reflects that ongoing contribution rather than penalizing anyone unfairly. Critics argue it penalizes visitors for something they can't control, where they happen to hold citizenship, and sets a precedent that could spread well beyond museum tickets into hotels, transport, and entry fees generally, effectively creating a 2-tier price system for an entire continent's tourism industry. Where does this actually go from here? The European Parliament passed a resolution in March 2026, specifically addressing over-tourism, signaling a shift away from simply taxing visitors and toward actively redistributing where tourists go in the first place, nudging travelers toward less crowded regions rather than just making the crowded ones more expensive. Cities like Dubrovnik, Prague, and Paris are watching closely, since all three face similar overcrowding pressure without yet adopting Venice or Barcelona's more aggressive measures. And industry analysts widely expect at least one of them to introduce a comparable entry fee or accommodation levy within the next 2 to 3 years. The likely outcome: more cities introduce some version of these fees over the next few years, not fewer, and the current patchwork of city-by-city rules will probably consolidate into something closer to a standard playbook that new destinations simply adopt wholesale rather than designing from scratch. So what does this actually mean if you're planning a European trip? The savvy move splitting out among frequent travelers right now is shifting toward lesser-known destinations in Northern and Eastern Europe, where costs remain dramatically lower and the backlash hasn't started, precisely because the crowds haven't arrived yet. Places that offer a genuinely similar cultural and architectural experience to Venice or Barcelona without any of the new fee structures or protest risk. Booking well in advance also matters more than it used to. Venice's own fee structure literally charges less for early bookings, and that pattern is likely to repeat as other cities design their own systems, meaning the spontaneous last-minute European city break is becoming a genuinely more expensive habit than it used to be. Traveling during shoulder season, outside the roughly 60 peak days Venice has designated, is another straightforward way to sidestep several of these new charges entirely, since most of these fee structures are explicitly designed around peak demand periods rather than applying uniformly year-round. The era of spontaneous, unplanned European city hopping is quietly ending, replaced by a version of travel that increasingly resembles booking flights. Pay less if you commit early, pay more if you decide at the last minute, and pay the most of all if you show up during the exact weeks everyone else does too. The bigger economic lesson here goes beyond travel. Whenever a shared resource, in this case, historic cities with limited infrastructure, gets treated as infinite by a market that keeps growing. Someone eventually has to introduce a price to manage demand. Venice's canals, Barcelona's housing stock, and Amsterdam's neighborhoods are all finite in a way that decades of tourism marketing conveniently ignored, treating each city as though it could absorb unlimited visitors without any real cost to the people who actually live there. What we're watching now is simply the price catching up to a reality that was always there beneath the surface, and it happened slowly and then all at once, which is exactly how these things tend to go. A quiet accumulation of pressure for years, followed by a sudden wave of policy that makes it look, from the outside, like the change came out of nowhere